The US has ordered Japan to put restrictions on China, and Japan has immediately done so. But why was Japan so depressed that it acted at the behest of the United States without even thinking about its losses? Restraint would have led to economic losses from which it is difficult to recover. But why didn't Japan think about it? What impact would both Japan and China face after the restriction? In recent times, Japan has stepped into the chip restriction moves on China. The export of chip manufacturing equipment as well as advanced chips to China is banned. The goal is to involve China in the chip crisis by imposing restrictions on chips. But the assumptions made by Japan did not materialize. Many aspects of the restrictions were ignored that will soon pop up on the surface. It is important to consider some insights to know what exactly will be the outcomes of the actions that Japan took. In order to understand what the impact of the restrictions will be in the long run, it is necessary to know why the restrictions were imposed in the first place. Were the restrictions the result of external pressure? China and Japan have always been part of healthy competition. In many industries, countries continued to surprise each other, but it never turned into a conflict. Japan was known for its automobile industry. Its exports were large in number, and its exports outnumbered all other countries. But as China introduced itself as a tech market, it mastered many sectors, including the automobile industry as well. Japan was somewhat replaced by China, but both nations never had personal conflicts with each other for that reason. Competition was healthy, and the reason that competition never turned into conflict as it did between the US and China is that Japan and China needed each other. The countries are separated by water and being very close to each other. Both see each other as a priority business. The trade relations between China and Japan are very serious. But the news came as a shock when Japan decided to restrict the chip exports to China. Japan has banned 45 nanometer chip exports to China. For those who don't know, the 45 nanometer chip is one of the most advanced chips used these days. These chips are used in almost all devices, and without their export, it can limit the production in huge Chinese companies. But what makes many individuals question is why the two countries, one of the best business partners, ended up here. In recent times, the only country that has tried to put chip sanctions on China is the US. The US tried everything to limit China's chip production, as well as chip exports from other nations. Sometimes the US approaches companies to ban chip-making equipment exports, and often it forces nations to put sanctions on China. Very recently, the US asked ASML to stop its lithography machine exports to China. The plan is to make the Chinese chip industry helpless. When ASML rejected the US's request, it was highlighted internationally. The ASML came forward and clearly expressed that it is not going to stop its business with China ever. And to prove this with actions, ASML even accelerated the order delivery to China. Now, the US was left helpless and had to hit China's chip industry with a different move. And the US thought of using no one else than Japan. Japan is China's closest business partner, but it is the US's closest ally. And more than other US closest allies, the US has old influential roots in Japan. According to experts, the US and Japan have maintained good relationships after the Second World War. The friendship has resulted in economic benefits, but also raised security concerns. The US's more than necessary influence on Japan makes it appear weak. According to the US State Department, the US maintained its influence over Japan with the help of corporations. This makes it very obvious that the US ordering Japan to do something will ultimately make Japan do it because of its very strong and deeply rooted influence. After being rejected from ASML, the US now hoped for Japan to ban the chip exports to China. Understandably, Japan is under US pressure, and the decision was a pressurized step. But the harm of this decision would be prominent. Japan's chip sales in China have always increased compared to the previous year. Last year, the sales reached 1,279 billion yuan. China is Japan's largest market, and its chip demand in China helped Japan become one of the largest chip exporters. The restrictions will not only make the Chinese tech industry face some limitations, but it will also impact Japanese sales. In some previous years, China has worked on dealing with challenges and reducing dependency on other countries. According to a report by Analysis Mason, China is getting 75% self-sufficiency in 5 key semiconductor categories. Within 5 years, China intends to reach 75% self-sufficiency. And this study tells us that despite sanctions and restrictions, China can achieve its goal. The government has made strategic plans to achieve self-sufficiency. The plan is backed by the Made in China 2025 initiative that highlights less dependence on other countries. According to IC, China has become the largest semiconductor consumer with a market value of $143 billion. With increased demand, self-sufficiency is necessary. The reason why China worked for self-sufficiency was to deal with challenges, and Japan's restrictions are one of the challenges China was ready to fight. This means the restrictions would not cause severe problems for China because it was already expecting this. China will be able to increase its chip production because it has made lithography machines as well. Thus, the impact of Japan's restrictions was not what was expected for China, but what would be the impact of these restrictions on Japan itself. China was a member of the Japanese supply chain. It was one of the significant markets for Japanese chips. Disturbing the trade relations with China would result in financial loss and a shake in the production alliance. Japan's economy heavily depends on exports, and mostly the revenue is generated from the chip export. 70% of Japan's total chips destination was China. Restricting China would make Japan lose its revenue, and as a result, China will also take some actions. Many Japanese companies are working in China. China also plays an important role in the Japanese supply chain. Some devices have been exported from China to Japan. But once restrictions are imposed, China will also impose bans on Japan. The economic consequences for Japan will be hard to bear. Japan has also shown interest in joining BRICS. But after the restrictions, it is clear that China will not let Japan join BRICS. China can never let a country become a part of BRICS that is under U.S. pressure. It simply means that Japan's loss is more than China's. Japan has supported the U.S., but currently the U.S. is not in the condition to favor Japan back. The U.S. is under the burden of a falling economy. It is under a debt crisis and is fight with de-dollarization at the same time. China will be able to fight Japan's restriction, and the plans are already in action. But the U.S. seems to have no options other than restriction to fight back. And mostly the restriction is not given the benefits the U.S. expected. So at this time, when the European countries have chosen China's side, Japan still decided to stand with the U.S. But what benefit can this provide Japan? How will the U.S., which is not able to help itself, provide any aid to Japan? I'll leave this up to you. Do you think Japan made the right choice by choosing the U.S.? Will the U.S. ever be able to do anything in return? What would losing China mean to Japan? Let me know in the comments section. Do you think it's only Japan who is at a loss right now? Subscribe to the channel and write your opinion in the comments.